it's Kaelyn, and this is my subjective feedback on our neuromyofascial inhibitory techniques activity involving a 10 rep overhead squat assessment before and after utilizing self myofascial rolling techniques on multiple soft tissues throughout the lower and upper body. So, when I performed the 10 rep overhead squat assessment before the foam rolling inhibitory techniques, I noticed a few things during this initial assessment. So first, I did not feel like I maintained contact with the ground very well through my feet. I felt like my weight was shifting towards different parts of my feet during the eccentric part of the squat. As I descended into each squat, I could feel the weight shifting off of my heels and towards the balls of my feet, suggesting a lack of ankle mobility and inhibited dorsiflexion in my ankles. Also, in addition to the weight shifting off of my heels, I also felt like my body weight was shifting towards the outside of my feet, like my feet were almost trying to turn out. Second, holding up my arms in the proper overhead position felt like it took entirely too much effort, and my upper body was considerably more fatigued by the 10th rep of this assessment. Not only did it feel hard to get my arms into the overhead position, but it felt even more difficult to hold them there throughout the duration of the assessment. Third, there was definitely tension in my lumbar spine. When I lifted my arms overhead into the position for the overhead squat assessment, as I performed the eccentric portion of each squat, I immediately felt more tension in my lumbar spine, like it was being forced into extension because of my lack of thoracic mobility to keep my arms up over my head. Fourth, there was definitely a ton of pressure on my knees themselves. I've been training long enough to know the difference between tension in your quads during squats and tension in your knee joint themselves. And I definitely felt like every single rep, my knees were bearing the load of my body weight, not my quads. And then fifth, I definitely felt like my chest and my arms were falling a little bit too far forward during the assessment. This was probably the movement dysfunction that I noticed the least and only happened at or near the bottom of my squat, potentially moving too low into the squat as well. So overall, I definitely felt like the most restricted joints in my assessment pre foam rolling were my ankles and my shoulders. So personally, I love self myofascial rolling. I'm actually very, very passionate about teaching as many of our athletes as possible about how to properly use a foam roller and how they can get so much out of a 5 to 10 minute session of just properly utilizing a foam roller. With all of that said, I also know this about myself that I have one major flaw that definitely holds me back from the positive effects that self myofascial rolling can have, and that is that I have an extremely low pain tolerance. So when it comes to discussing the technique that I had the most discomfort with when foam rolling, the short answer is all of them. But on a sliding scale, there were definitely ones on higher on the end of the discomfort scale, and that was the perineals, TFL, adductors, QL, and lats. So perineals, TFL, and adductor, my initial assumption as to why these muscles are more uncomfortable to roll out than, say, my quads or my hamstrings has to do with the shape of the muscle itself. So the adductors, perineals, and TFL, they're all longer and thinner in comparison to the shape of a quad or a hamstring. So there isn't a ton of space there. They sit a lot closer to the bone. So that explains why there would be a lot more pressure when you're foam rolling these muscles than, say, necessarily your quad or your hamstring. So in addition to that, which is why there's most likely more discomfort when foam rolling, these muscles are also stabilizer muscles. So they're constantly on during any type of functional movement, even if they are acting in more of an isometric fashion. But in the presence of movement dysfunction, we know that they can become synergistically dominant. So all of these factors could lead to an increased amount of tension in these muscles and increase the discomfort when foam rolling them. So specifically for the hip adductors, while it's truly, again, higher on the discomfort scale for me, this is one of the muscle groups that I have really come to enjoy spending time self myofascial rolling. I definitely think this was more uncomfortable in this specific instance because it's not a muscle group that I typically spend a ton of time with training and strengthening in isolation during my training sessions. But the last few months, my training sessions have really been centered around increasing my back squat numbers. So the adductors obviously play a huge role in knee and hip stabilization during squatting movements. So that is the perfect recipe for increased tension in that muscle group. So I know personally that I respond significantly better from heavy squat days when I spend time foam rolling this muscle group. And I've definitely found improved hip mobility, allowing me to access a better range in my squat when I spend time foam rolling my adductors. This definitely took some time for me to build up the tolerance to be able to do. But one of the tissue movements that I have really found effective in utilizing when foam rolling your hip adductors is moving your hips into internal rotation while sitting on the foam roller as well. So while I was rolling out my QL and my lats, these were the two muscle groups that were the most uncomfortable for me in this activity. I was so uncomfortable. I could not even move the foam roller. I had to sit on the foam roller for between 10 to 15 seconds, sit up, move the foam roller, and then put that muscle group back on the foam roller for the duration of the 60 to 90 seconds that I spent foam rolling each muscle group. These were definitely the two muscle groups that I could have benefited from foam rolling with a less dense foam roller. And I think that additionally, some of the discomfort stemmed from the fact that I had never foam rolled these muscle groups before. I think some of that was fear for putting too much tension with a foam roller on my lumbar spine, and also um, putting too much tension between a foam roller and my ribs. So I'd never really spent much time foam rolling these muscle groups. So I definitely think that that was definitely contributed to the discomfort as well. So after performing all of the inhibitory foam rolling techniques, I instantly felt so much better. And that definitely showed in the post foam rolling overhead squat assessment. So working from the ground up, the same way that we talked about them in the pre-assessment, I felt like I maintained contact with the ground through my feet so much better post in the post assessment than I did in the pre-assessment. Um, my heels definitely weren't coming off the ground as much. I didn't feel like the weight was shifting onto the outside of my feet as well. Holding my arms above my head felt so much easier after I had foam rolled my thoracic spine. When I foam roll my thoracic spine, I actually prefer to cross my arms over my chest and protract my shoulders a little bit to move my scapula out of the way so that the foam roller can better access my rhomboids, my middle and lower trap better than it could if my arms were either over my head or straight out in front of me. I also felt significantly less tension in my lower back, definitely due to my improved thoracic mobility. And because of that, I achieved thoracic extension, which helped me keep my arms over my head, which did not require me then to extend through my lumbar spine. There was also significantly less pressure on my knees, which I'm almost positive came from me just simply rolling out my quads. And lastly, I definitely noticed that my chest didn't fall forward as much in my second assessment than it did in my first one. So I have typically prescribed self-myofascial rolling techniques for our athletes on their more recovery centered days, because I know that's where I'm going to get the most intent when it comes to spending any time self-myofascial rolling. But through this activity, I now see the impact that self-myofascial rolling can immediately have on movement quality. And in smaller group settings, I could definitely see us adding this to the beginning of training sessions for our athletes. So this concludes my subjective feedback on our discussion 2A.